Today, we dive back into the story of King David. Now, I know it's summer, and some of you have been here and there and everywhere and may have missed a bit of the story thus far. So, a brief recap of the two chapters before this one. By and large, for David, things are pretty peachy right now. He's just become the king of Israel. He's defeated the biggest enemy that Israel has, the Philistines. Jerusalem is now his city, quite literally called the City of David. He has a great new cedar palace with lots of wives, concubines, and children running around. And God is now literally with him, since he has successfully gotten the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. You remember that back then, they believed that the presence of God literally resided in the Ark of the Covenant. So as a new king, David has been going nonstop, kind of like the Energizer Bunny. And it seems that he finally has a moment to take a breath, to kick up his feet a bit and relax. Now, when this happens, when we actually stop and catch our breath, sometimes we get really good ideas. Our text today says that David is settled into his house. So who knows, perhaps he is having a drink by the pool, literally kicking his feet up and taking a breather, when all of a sudden, seemingly out of the blue, he gets the best idea ever. He starts thinking about how much God has done for him, and the fact that God is essentially living in a tent, while he is living in this mansion palace of a house. And he says to himself, hey, I'm the king, right? I can do anything. I am going to build God a really nice house. God deserves that. Now, David is so excited about his epiphany that he blurts it out to Nathan. This is the first time that we hear about Nathan, and the writer tells us that he's a prophet, which means that his job is to keep the king in check, to remind the king of God's desires, God's promises, God's commandments, to not let ego cloud good judgment or God's will. But like kings, prophets are human, and they don't always get it right. So while we don't really know anything about Nathan yet, in this moment, it seems like he's kind of a yes man, because he jumps on King David's idea immediately. Yes, a house for God, great idea, go ahead and get started. Now, whether or not David was seeking Nathan's endorsement or not, he got it. And it was a green light. The Lord is with you, Nathan says. So the bandwagon has officially been jumped upon. Both David and Nathan think building God a house is a great idea. How could this not be a good thing, after all? Well, like many of our best laid plans, God had a different idea. And that night, the Lord comes to Nathan in a dream and rains on their parade, raising this simple question: are you the one to build me a house to live in? I haven't ever lived in a house. From the day I brought your people out of Egypt until today, I've been fine in a tent and in a tabernacle. And in all those years, did I ever say to anybody, why doesn't somebody build me a house of cedar? Well, rats, God. Why do you have to be such a party pooper? God sucks the air out of their party and out of their egos. And that's because God had an even better party, if you will, planned. But they didn't know it. Pastor Eugene Peterson explains, there are times when our grand human plans to do something for God are seen, after a night of prayer, to be a huge human distraction from what God is doing for us. That's what Nathan realized that night. God showed Nathan that David's building plans for God would interfere with God's building plans for David. You see, David got excited about something that he saw a vision for, without stopping to consider whether it was a part of God's vision. Now, before we expound on that, I want to point out a few key things in this passage. First, in verses 1, 2, and 3, David is referred to as the king. But when God refers to David, God calls him my servant. It seems that David is a little too conscious of his position as king. Now, yes, in relation to all of the people inside and outside of Israel, David is the highest authority in the land. But in relation to God, God reminds David that, hey, you are my servant. David appears to be wanting to give God a helping hand, and so God kind of puts David in his place by referring to David as a servant and by saying, who are you to be building me a house? Now, I say it a lot from this pulpit, but it always seems to be relevant. Essentially, God is God, and we are not. The people in the Bible struggle with this just as much as we do. The second thing to point out is that in verses 6 through 11, God explains why building a temple is not necessary. And the first reason God gives is in verse 6, and it can be summed up this way: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Throughout Israel's history, from Mount Sinai to the reign of David, the tabernacle had protected the ark and gotten the job done just fine. God was with the people as the ark was kept in the tabernacle. And when the people moved from one place to another, the tabernacle and the ark went with them. God never left them. God gave them victory over their enemies and possession of the promised land. I mean, their history bore testimony to the fact that there was nothing to fix. The tabernacle, as God's house, was working just fine. The third thing is that in verse 7, God gives yet another reason for there being no real need for a temple. I didn't ask for one. Now, the instructions that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai about the construction of the tabernacle were so detailed, meticulously detailed, chapters and chapters. So you would think that if the plans had changed and God wanted a temple instead, that surely God would have let them know about it. The fourth thing is that in verses 8 through 11, God really gets to the heart of the matter by saying, you know, this is about what I can do for you, not what you do for me. I don't know if you noticed, but the pronoun I is mentioned a lot starting in verse 8. Eugene Peterson says the message that Nathan delivers to David is dominated by a recital of what God has done, is doing, and will do. God is the first-person subject of 23 verbs in his message. And these verbs carry the action. David, full of what he's going to do for God, is now subjected to a comprehensive rehearsal of what God has done, is doing, and will do for David. What looked yesterday like a bold Davidic enterprise on behalf of God now looks kind of ridiculous. So in rehearsing David's history, God reminds David who is taking care of whom. Again, it's that theme, God is God and we are not. The fifth thing is that there is a change from past tense verb to future tense verbs. After pointing out all that God has done for David and Israel, God goes on to say, David, my servant, you haven't seen anything yet. The best is yet to come. God proceeds to tell David that God's going to appoint a place for the people of Israel where they can dwell in peace. The wicked will no longer afflict them. It won't be like it used to be from the time of the judges. God will give David rest from his enemies. This promise is solidified when God says, David will not build me a house, but I will build a house for David. To truly understand this sentence, you have to understand a bit of wordplay in Hebrew. The word for house in Hebrew can mean two different things. One meaning is literally a place where somebody dwells. Another meaning is a dynasty. So while David is talking about building God a physical house, God is using a play on words to say, I'm going to build you, David, not just a house, but a dynasty, a legacy of which there will be no end. This is such a significant promise that it's called the Davidic covenant. God promises to raise up David's offspring, and they'll rule after him forever. Now, those of us on this side of history know that David's line lasts for many years, but it's definitely not forever. Eventually, Israel's taken into exile in Babylon, and David's line of kings ends. But while it seemed for a moment that God had broken the promise, it's more like God had a different, non-conventional idea of how to fulfill it. And that idea, Christians believe, is that this king is Jesus. Jesus of the house of David became the leader that God had promised. And as such, David's line then does go on forever, because Jesus came to earth to show us the kingdom or the kingdom of God, how we are to live together and love each other and spread the good news of God's love. But that's all in the future. Let's get back to where we are in today's text. David, after learning of Nathan's vision and promise, doesn't fight it. He actually listens. David realizes that God is right and starts to give God glory and praise. Essentially, he does a complete 180 in his idea about building God a house. He realizes how his desire was not, in fact, God's desire. So to summarize this whole exchange, it's not that David's inherent idea is bad. After all, God will actually have a temple built by Solomon. And it's not that David's intentions are in the wrong place. David wanted to do something good for God. It's just that David's desire to build a house for God didn't align at all with God's plan for David's future. And even more, God had a much greater plan in mind, something greater than even David could imagine. God essentially says, I'm going to make your family great. It's going to be through a lineage, not a literal house. But how could David have ever imagined that on his own? This passage is another great example of how human David is, I think. Probably a lot of us can relate to David's excitement about a great idea that turned out either not to be so great or not to be the right direction to go. Anybody? 2, good. If you haven't had this experience, essentially it goes like this. You feel like something is so right for your life, and you're gung-ho, excited about it, on board, telling your friends and family about it. You sort of justified in your mind that it's God's will for whatever reason, and then all of a sudden something happens, doesn't matter what, the plan unravels, and you realize, oh, maybe that wasn't the right thing for my life or my family. Now, we can't always attribute these things to something that's God's will and not God's will. Sometimes it's just life. And often it doesn't become clear as quickly as it did for David, like overnight. Figuring out the way God is leading us is not easy, and there is no formula I can give you today. I'm sorry if you came here looking for one. But there's no one right way of how to figure out whether or not you're operating out of your own goodwill, or whether you're actually following God's will, or whether those two things are one and the same, which I think often is the case. Here's the thing, though. We can lose a lot of sleep, and we can make ourselves crazy if we are always praying for God's will to be revealed in our lives before we ever make a move. We can pray and pray and pray, but I think that sometimes God's will is more likely to be revealed in how we respond to whatever happens after we make a decision. We can't get frozen in that prayer stage of just waiting for some miraculous sign. I'll give you an example from my own life, and it may seem kind of trite now, but at the time, for me, it was a really big deal. My senior year in college, I had discerned that divinity school was the path that I was on, and needed to, figure out what school that would be. I researched 6 seminaries or divinity schools in depth, and I ended up applying to 3. I loved all 3 for different reasons, and I told myself that, whichever school gave me the best financial scholarship, well, that would clearly be the school that God wanted me to attend. 2 of the schools had pretty good scholarship opportunities. The third really didn't at all, but that was kind of a long shot application for me anyway. So I interviewed at the first school, and through the process was offered a great financial scholarship. And I pretty much thought, wow, God is speaking loud and clear on this one. This is great. But then 2 weeks later, I got an equal scholarship at the second school I applied to. And now I had a decision on my hands, and I was literally agonizing over which of these 2 schools I would attend, kind of writing off the third school. And then I received a letter from that third school, the long shot school that didn't give scholarships, that said not only did I get in, but I also got the same financial scholarship. I can literally remember it like it was yesterday, running across campus to my professor's office and saying, "This is impossible. They don't even give scholarships. They told me they don't give scholarships." And he said, "Yeah, they don't give scholarships. I've never seen this." So we called the admissions office together, and lo and behold, there was a new president of the university who had just started a month prior, and he decided to start something called the Presidential Scholarship. And each of the smaller schools at that university, like the Education School, the Design School, the Divinity School, they were able to award one scholarship to an incoming student of that school's choice. Nobody knew about this program. To this day, I don't know why I got that scholarship, but I did. Now, while this seems like a dream come true, and definitely a first world problem, full ride scholarships to 3 schools, I was frustrated. My plan to figure out which school God wanted me to attend was thwarted. And this was divinity school, after all, and I was going to be a minister. Don't I have to be absolutely certain of God's will in this situation? Because if I mess this up, who knows how messed up my ministry is going to be? How can I make this decision? You may know that quote, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Well, I felt like God was laughing for sure. I was under a time crunch to make a decision. I was agonizing about it. I went to my pastor's office, was talking about the pros and cons of the school, and if I'm honest, I probably just wanted my pastor to tell me which school to go to. But instead, he said, "Anne, you are trying so hard to figure out which school God wants you to attend. Has it occurred to you that it doesn't really matter to God which school you attend? Because whatever school you attend, God will be there with you. There's not a wrong choice here. Just pick one that you feel is best, and God will be with you." Now, that moment was one of those huge light bulb moments for me that has helped me in far more difficult decisions than what divinity school to attend. To know that no matter my choice or decision, God will be with me is really quite freeing. This doesn't mean you don't pray about something or talk to trusted friends and mentors to get advice, but it does mean that at the end of the day, worrying about whether or not something is God's will and waiting for a clear sign that it is God's will may not be the best course to take. Sometimes you just have to start down a road and pay attention to how doors are opening or how roadblocks are popping up, and use that as a guide. If you think about it, this is what happened to David. He had a great idea that he thought for sure was God's will, but then God gave David a different understanding, and David actually listened. His course was corrected. He was redirected through the vision of Nathan. David listened to the wisdom of his friend and prophet. And I think that's a big part of figuring out just what our goodwill is and what is God's will. We know that Jesus didn't work in isolation, and the Apostle Paul didn't either. Listening to what others are saying is another way to discern if you're on the right path. Because sometimes we just need to get out of our own heads and see the bigger picture. The last point here I want to make is based on a quote that Frederick Buechner said about vocation. He said that, your true vocation is the place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. But I think this quote can work for a lot of decisions beyond just your job or vocation. Because I believe God's will for us is to do something that fulfills our lives and uses our gifts always. But we have to have a way to check our desires, right? To make sure that we're not just serving ourselves, but rather to ask, what need is this meeting in the world? David's idea had one half of the equation. It brought him great joy to think about building a great house for God. But it didn't meet a real need. If you're trying to discern whether or not something is just your good idea or whether it's something perhaps that God is calling you to do, I invite you to think about, who does this serve besides myself? Am I just paying attention to the needs of those around me, or am I thinking about the world around me? In her book, Lucky Boy, author Shanti Sekaran wrote, "Good intentions, these scared him the most. People with good intentions tended not to question themselves. And people who don't question themselves are the ones to watch out for." We always have to ask ourselves, is our decision or action helping us to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God? Is it leading us down a path of looking out for the vulnerable and the oppressed, the forgotten, the silenced, the marginalized? Because that's who Jesus hung out with and cared for. And we all believe, I think, that Jesus came to show us the inside of God, how God thinks, how God acts, what God cares about. I mean, it's kind of a cliche, but do you remember those old WWJD bracelets? What would Jesus do? Well, honestly, it's a pretty concrete way of trying to discern God's will, because we have Jesus' life to look at. What would Jesus do? It may help you to know that Jesus himself struggled with wanting what was best for him versus what God had for him. In the Garden of Gethsemane, before his death, he prays, "Lord, if you are willing, take this cup from me, but not my will, but your will be done." This is a lifetime struggle. And honestly, as I wrote this sermon, I realized that through any struggle of discernment, one thing is always true: God is with you. So the fact that God will be with you, no matter what decision you make, is perhaps the key to discerning God's will. Could it be that simple? Could it be that discerning God's will is merely trusting that God will be with you, no matter what? Amen.